Hear me. Thank you. Thank you very much. Allow me to also thank the organizers of this session, and thank you to all the participants that have joined us today for this short course. My colleagues and I will take this opportunity to take you through an overview of the research and technical assistance that UNCTAD provides to small island development states, but also to other developing countries to harness the potential of e-commerce and the digital economy. So let us first talk a little bit about the broader picture. Digitalization has an impact on all sustainable development goals. It changes the way that we learn, the way that we connect, we trade, we work together, and it has both opportunities and challenges linked to it. On the one hand, it can improve a lot of aspects, but also it can deepen divides. And to take this into account, it's necessary to create new policies that build inclusive digital economies. This is often a challenge for policymakers to make those critical choices and to, rather than reinforcing existing divides, to help reverse the trend and to build together a more inclusive digital future. I would also like to take just a few moments to focus on why e-commerce and digital trade matter in particular. Rather than just being tools, they are a new engine for economic growth and diversification. They drive productivity, they unlock innovation, and they also present a platform for inclusion. For example, they can unlock opportunities for women, for youth, and for small businesses in developing countries, and open doors that were previously closed. They can also be a catalyst for structural change. For many LDCs and SIDS countries, this offers a leapfrog opportunity, diversifying economies but also moving up value chains. For this to happen, what is necessary is to have smart regulation. We must shape e-commerce and digital trade with rules that develop the trust, but also protect privacy and serve people. It's important to take also into account the aspect of resilience. In times of crisis, as we have seen, digital channels can keep trade flowing, and this is important and essential. It is also a matter of global solidarity. Connectivity without capacity can deepen divides, and we can't just invest in the infrastructure that allows this connectivity, but also we need to invest in the capacity building of people for that digital future that I described earlier. There are quite a few entry point challenges for small island development states in e-commerce and digital trade. And they relate to some of the challenges that Rashid mentioned earlier in the very informative presentation. These are linked to limited connectivity, low internet penetration, and high infrastructure costs. For example, the mobile broadband penetration rate in SIDS countries is 63 subscriptions per 100, and it's much lower than the global average. Affordability also remains an important concern. There are high internet costs, high data and device costs. For example, the price of data-only mobile broadband is almost twice the world's median, which is quite high. At the same time, there are infrastructure deficits, poor logistics, and submarine cable vulnerabilities that are so essential for ensuring digital connectivity. Other aspects include the low digital literacy gaps that persist in this sphere, as well as financing barriers, scarce early-stage capital, and high collateral requirements, risk aversion. All of these lead to additional barriers. All of these challenges are compounded by structural and external factors, by a fragmented payments ecosystem, often exhibiting low interoperability, high cross-border transaction costs. There are also weak institutional and legal capacity constraints. So often, some of the agencies involved will be under-resourced, or there will be difficulty in enforcing laws, or legislation would stand pending for updates for a very long time. At the same time, we shouldn't forget the exposure to external shocks, something that was also quite relevant in Rashid's presentation. Natural disasters disrupt small island development states. They disrupt digital networks, and inflation and geopolitical risks. They also put further pressure. At the same time, small island development states are incredibly diverse. Their exports profiles are also diverse. Singapore accounts for over 90% of sales of digitally deliverable services by SIDS, and 82% of SIDS services exports in general. And perhaps just to note on the graph, the spike in 2020, it reflects the drop in travel and transport services and doesn't represent a surge in digitally deliverable exports. So the challenges are quite real, but they're not insurmountable. With smart partnerships, with tailored support, it's possible to overcome these difficulties and to help unlock the potential of e-commerce and the digital economy in small island development states. UNCTAD's work, and in particular the e-commerce and digital economy program, focuses on two major challenges: the limited readiness of developing countries to engage in and benefit from e-commerce and the digital economy, and at the same time the limited effectiveness and the scale of international support. Our approach focuses on the three pillars: research and analysis, technical assistance, consensus building, and dialogue. And there are a number of actions under those pillars. So given the timing and the shortness of the course today, we will not be able to go into all of these areas, but we will take the opportunity to zoom into a few key areas that help harness e-commerce and digital economy for inclusive, sustainable development. E-trade readiness assessments is one aspect of the e-commerce and digital economy program. Their context is very much to create a snapshot of the readiness of particular countries. And as you see, and I hope you can see, we have worked in now over 40 countries. There are 40 assessments that have been developed since 2017. And they analyze the e-commerce and the digital economy ecosystem. They look specifically in 7 policy areas: the overall strategic and policy framework relevant for digital and e-commerce aspects, the ICT infrastructure, trade logistics, trade facilitation and logistics, payment solutions, the legal and regulatory frameworks, as well as e-commerce skills development and access to financing. So these assessments reflect what is the current situation in the country in those areas, but they also accompany the report with an action matrix, which includes targeted recommendations, what should change and how this could take place. So we very much look at the ET-readies, as we call them, as action-oriented reports. They are not meant to be static, but they are meant to drive development and to implement those reforms in the future. So I have highlighted some of the small island development states where we have worked. These are Samoa, the Solomon Islands, Timor-Leste, Trinidad and Tobago, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu in terms of e-trade readiness assessment so far. In addition to assessing the situation regarding e-commerce and the digital economy, UNCTAD also focuses on providing tailored policy support through specific e-commerce strategies and action plans for countries that are interested to take that further step beyond the more general recommendations. Where do governments and regional organizations really want to focus in a specific time period and to drive forward reforms? So UNCTAD provides support with this, helping them think of the common vision, the prioritization of reforms, and we work with the whole of government approach in mind and through a very inclusive and participatory process. At the end, what we tend to develop jointly with the government and also with a range of stakeholders, including the private sector, civil society, and academia, and also representatives of vulnerable groups, we have a detailed implementation plan that can then be implemented to drive forward reforms in the area of e-commerce and the digital economy. So some of the strategies that we have carried out in SIDS include an e-commerce strategy in Fiji, an e-commerce strategy in the Solomon Islands, and also an e-commerce strategy in Trinidad and Tobago, as well as an e-commerce policy in Samoa. And we have a strategy which is currently being developed in Timor-Leste. Even when we have those important tools in place, such as an action matrix or a very detailed strategy to implement, it is often difficult to implement the reforms that are needed. This is often due to limited resources, financial, technical, or human resources constraints, weak coordination on the side of institutional structures. There is sometimes low institutional capacity or limited political prioritization of the topics. And there can be governance gaps. Committees and platforms could exist, but they could be under-resourced. They might not meet regularly enough to drive forward developments. And low inclusivity tends to be another barrier. Private sector engagement is essential for e-commerce and digital economy reforms. And the participation of women, of youth, of rural communities, of other groups, persons with disabilities, is important to drive forward that progress in an inclusive manner. So because of these issues, since 2020, UNCTAD's e-trade implementation support mechanism provides a platform for experience sharing, for South-South learning, and for networking and discussing those challenges to see how we can learn from each other. So there is a network of focal points from all the countries where we have worked in terms of e-trade readiness assessments and e-commerce strategies that can work together to overcome these issues in the implementation process. Another interesting and innovative tool that UNCTAD has recently developed to support implementation is the e-trade reform tracker. This is an online platform, a web-based tool, which drives forward the coordination, it supports the communication, as well as the monitoring of e-commerce and digital trade reforms. And it supports and integrates a results-based mechanism. It is a tool that is intuitive, that's easy to use, and that is offered by UNCTAD to all the countries where we have worked in terms of e-commerce reforms. And among small island developing states, we have rolled it out in the Solomon Islands, in Samoa and Fiji, and it is also planned for Trinidad and Tobago. I would also like to briefly mention our regional approach in the case of the Pacific. The Pacific Digital Economy Program is quite a unique partnership between UNCDF, UNDP, and UNCTAD, which has worked in 10 Pacific Island countries that you can hopefully see on the screen, and is being supported by Australia, New Zealand, and the European Union. And this support has really focused on fostering an inclusive and resilient digital ecosystem in those countries. In the following slides, you can see an overview of the different activities that have taken place across UNCTAD's 3 pillars. And as you can see, there has been quite a lot in all of them. Different research and analysis activities that some of my colleagues will reflect on later, technical cooperation, including ET readies and e-commerce strategies that I mentioned. The implementation support mechanism is, of course, involving all the countries in the program. The e-trade reform tracker that I mentioned, but also a variety of capacity building, regional trainings on e-commerce and law reform, measuring the digital economy, activities of the E-Trade for Women program, and then a number of consensus building and partnership activities. So finally, I just want to note a few lessons that we have learned from technical assistance that UNCTAD has provided so far. There have been quite a few lessons, but I will just focus on what are some of the success factors that we see for developing the e-commerce and digital economy framework in different countries. Having a long-term and consistent vision on the side of the government or the regional organization involved tends to be very important. An inclusive governance framework is also something that is essential for pushing forwards those important reforms. Support to innovation, to community-driven initiative helps along the process, and having an articulated implementation structure, having a dedicated team with M&E capacities makes it happen in reality. Of course, resource mobilization is a key aspect. Having strong partners' support can really drive forward the implementation of a variety of recommendations that would not be possible if it's done by a government or regional organization alone. And regional cooperation, also in the example of the Pacific, has shown us that it can act as a powerful driver to accelerate implementation of national e-commerce enabling reforms. So for example, the regional e-commerce strategy in the Pacific mandated countries to develop their own national e-commerce strategies. And this process has really supported the development of e-commerce and the overall ecosystem in those countries. So with this, I would like to thank you, and I will pass the word to my colleague Thomas, who will take you through the Pacific edition of our digital economy report. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much. And great to be here with you and be able to highlight some of the research we've done in the context of the Pacific Digital Economy Program. I want to specifically talk about the Pacific Digital Economy Report, which is the first regional edition of the Digital Economy Report. We have two reports published, the first in 2022, which was more of a baseline study. And recently we have published the second one, which is updating some of the information of the previous report, but also adding to that. And as was mentioned before, one of the challenges is the data availability, especially for SIDS. So the second report also relies quite a bit on interviews with experts, with entrepreneurs, and with policymakers to kind of give that extra layer and fill the gaps of what we cannot necessarily find in the data. And this second report also connects the dots between the infrastructure challenges that we see in the region and the relationship to digital entrepreneurship and digital trade. Of course, the connectivity is still the essential aspect and the basis that the digital economy is built on. So it remains important to look at that. And as was mentioned already before, for SIDS there are some specific challenges because of the remoteness, for instance, and the small market sizes. And in the Pacific, we see that there has been quite a bit of progress recently, especially when it comes to submarine cables. But the situation is still vulnerable. There are still quite a number of countries that are relying only on one cable. And we've seen in the past, for instance, in the case of Tonga, that with an earthquake or any natural disasters, these cables are vulnerable and can break, and then all of a sudden there's no internet anymore. So this is still a situation that is very relevant as well for the Pacific. And it's only to be expected in 2026 that all Pacific SIDS will be connected with at least one cable. The report also looks at, and that's more an emerging issue, the low Earth orbit satellites from Starlink. So that's an emerging issue that comes again with its own set of challenges also in terms of policies. Mobile networks are still important. The mobile phone is the primary access point for most people in Pacific SIDS, and I think in most developing countries. And the coverage at the moment of 4G in the Pacific is about almost 60% across the Pacific as a group. But of course, we know these countries are very different, and countries with a higher population concentrations have higher coverage of the population versus countries with more dispersed populations and smaller islands. So that also still remains a concern. Affordability, I'm going through these a little bit in the highlights. The report has much more details, but in the interest of time, I cannot go into everything in detail. So I'm giving a bit of an overview. But the affordability was mentioned, and that's as well quite an important issue. The Broadband Commission advocates for a 2% cost of broadband subscriptions, 2% of the gross national income. And currently in the Pacific, we see that only 3 countries, French Polynesia, New Caledonia, and Cook Islands, are the only countries that actually reach this goal. And for many countries, it's still the high cost of broadband continues to be a concern. Internet performance is another area that we looked at in terms of connectivity, and there as well, maybe not surprisingly with the limited cables as well for many countries, this remains a concern, with fixed broadband in the Pacific SIDS just being 1/4 of the SIDS average in terms of speed. And we also hear from the businesses through the interviews that, for instance, in Tonga, entrepreneurs indicate that they need multiple connections just to keep their online presence. So as you can imagine, that also comes with extra cost. Smartphone adoption, as mentioned, this is the main entry point for most people to connect to the internet. And there we see that it's reached already 80% of adoption in the Pacific, which is quite high, expected to rise to 90% by 2030, which is also quite high. But we also note here that smartphones are a way to connect and do enable e-commerce and digital trade. But nowadays, they're also not sufficient to really participate, especially when you talk about digital entrepreneurship, especially when you need, for setting up a web shop or using AI, a smartphone often is just not powerful enough and not the right tool. So it's good to keep in mind that, yes, you're connected, but it's still limited to how much you can interact and benefit from opportunities that the digital economy offers. As mentioned, connectivity is important, but it's definitely not the only factor. It also is about people when you talk about the digital economy and digital entrepreneurship. And there's some interesting projects and initiatives that are going on in the Pacific. And we see that, as mentioned, digital entrepreneurship has the potential to enhance economic resilience, drive growth, and help overcome geographic isolation in the wider markets and access wider markets beyond the region. However, there are definitely quite a number of challenges in this area as well. And one of them is the digital skills gap. The information on the screen shows a little bit that this is a serious concern, where we see that, for instance, in Fiji, only a third of individuals report on having only basic ICT competencies. And 4.4% completed advanced ICT tasks. That's a very low percentage of the population, while being very important for developing a good base of digital entrepreneurship. We see that there are a number of incubators that are supporting this, that are trying to help overcome this challenge. but their capacity is generally quite limited. And we see that in the absence of wider support in this area, there are some informal peer networks and online communities where people come together and still seek to overcome some of these challenges, but it is not a structural solution, and definitely more work needs to be done in that area. Another important aspect is the access to finance. And here there are some challenges because most digital entrepreneurs do not necessarily fit the picture of what lenders are looking for, such as tangible assets and stable revenue streams, or established credit histories. So they struggle to get the finances to start their business. And some cases are quite extreme. In Kiribati, for instance, it costs between 1/3 and 1/2 of the average annual income to start a business. So this is a major obstacle as well in the digital economy. Then I want to go to the labor force participation, and especially the participation of women in the digital economy in the Pacific. We looked at that specifically in the report. And we see that there is quite an underrepresentation of women in high growth sectors such as ICT. And it remains significantly lower than men. And many jobs that women participate are more in the informal sector, lower paid, or they take care of unpaid responsibilities. And there's also risks that particularly women face when they go online, including harassment and social isolation. The report looked at legal frameworks, also from the perspective of women participation in the digital economy, and several areas that you can see on the screen were particularly highlighted. And for the Pacific, we see that globally, only 44% of legal provisions support women's participation and economic rights. And for the Pacific, most of the countries fall behind the benchmarks that are set. And they leave women in vulnerable places, for instance, when it comes to platform-based work environments. And it's also, again, as mentioned before, important to address the online safety and trust for meaningful inclusion of women in the digital economy. And finally, the access to finance. Again, we see quite a gap there as well between women and men. And for instance, only 60% of women in Fiji have access to a bank account, and just over 1/3 of the women in Samoa. So this is quite a challenge as well to get to promote the participation of women in the digital economy. The last area that the report looks at is the digital trade in the Pacific. And again, this can help to diversify economies to access global markets through the platforms, through e-commerce, through digital deliverable services. However, in the Pacific, this really remains still in the infancy, and there's quite a number of challenges there as well, despite all the opportunities that digital trade can offer to SIDS. First, we looked at the digital platforms that are available and operating in the Pacific. And one of the main findings is that most of the e-commerce or digital e-commerce is actually taking place on informal platforms or social media platforms like Facebook. There are a few national platforms, but they really focus on the domestic market. There are some attempts to include other markets as well, but this has so far not happened. And it's interesting to see that global platforms are not really operating in the market, such as Amazon. And this is often limited by technical challenges, compliance, and logistical challenges. It's simply, again, we come back to the small markets as well. It's not interesting for these big platforms to operate there. And it comes back to skills as well, because a lot of the entrepreneurs are not ready to engage with these platforms or have the skills to engage with them, and infrastructure challenges as well. So you would think that they can benefit, but it's more complicated than that for SIDS. It's not as easy to benefit from these international platforms and access international markets as you would think. And this is still not even taking into account more traditional challenges such as shipping costs, customs procedures, logistics, and access to finance and digital payment solutions, which are all challenges that they also face. Then digital deliverable services, that is a potential pathway for overcoming geographical barriers. So we looked at that specifically as well, because you would think that software development, e-learning, business process outsourcing are all sectors that could provide this opportunity, all taking place online, and circumvent the geographical challenges for these countries. But also here we see that this still remains a lot in the early stages, and many of the challenges mentioned before play a role here, whether it's the connectivity or the skills or access to finance. So yes, the potential is there, but there are still many challenges to overcome. And we see this as well in the data, where the digital deliverable services across all SIDS increased by an average of 12% between 2010 and 2023. For Pacific SIDS, excluding Fiji, experienced actually a 4% decline. So this calls for really strengthening those policy areas and addressing the challenges related to the skills, logistics, etc. Then I just want to refer to another study we did in the Pacific, also under the Pacific Digital Economy Program, which is the gap analysis of cyber laws in Pacific small island development states, really looking at the key laws and regulations relevant for creating an enabling environment for digital economy, such as electronic data transactions, data protection, consumer rights, etc. And here as well, we see that many provisions, many of those areas, there are gaps in the laws, and the region could benefit from a more harmonized approach, legal approach. And just to conclude, and circling back a little bit to what my colleague was talking about, the assessments and the e-commerce strategies, all of these, the report really supports kind of the research for the region, and as well provides context for the strategies, but they remain very important because every country is different, and within the SIDS and within a region like the Pacific, there are big differences between countries. So the national assessments remain really key, and the implementation framework as well. So let me leave it there. Thank you very much.
So UNCTAD already has a statistics team that publishes trade data tables in the UNCTAD statistical portal. So why is there also a small team working on e-commerce and digital economy measurement in our branch? It's because when UNCTAD started working on e-commerce and the information economy 20 years ago, we looked for national statistics to inform our analytical work and policy guidance, and we found nothing. There was very little from developed countries and practically nothing from developing countries. So countries wanted our take on how to manage the evolving digital economy, and we could only provide estimates and make assumptions. And the need for statistics to inform policymaking on the digital economy is just gaining importance and visibility with every year that passes. The last UNCTAD mandate in the Bridgetown Covenant called to support and strengthen the production of statistics in relation to the opportunities and challenges of the digital economy. Next slide, please. So what does UNCTAD do to support and strengthen the production of digital economy statistics? Well, in 2005, we launched our first data collection to assess such statistics in developing countries, which showed very little availability and comparability. And as a result, we added methodological development, where we helped achieve a core list of digital economy indicators that was endorsed by the UN Statistical Commission. We created a manual and a training course to build the capacity building of developing countries to produce these indicators. The digital economy evolves constantly, and so its measurement must also evolve. For that, we have a working group of experts on measuring e-commerce and the digital economy that meets every year and reports to the Intergovernmental Group of Experts on E-commerce and the Digital Economy. And the next meeting of this working group is on 4 and 5 December of this year. The notification was sent to the missions in September, so I take this opportunity to encourage the permanent missions present here to support the participation of statistical experts from your capital. The data collection that first started in 2005 is now conducted every 2 years. We contact national statistical offices and other producers of official statistics to request the results of their latest statistical exercises. And the figures that are reported by countries are published in the UNCTAD statistical portal in the form of digital economy tables. Next slide, please. As I mentioned before, UNCTAD led the development of a core list of indicators on the digital economy that could represent a minimum common denominator that could be collected by most countries and that are comparable. The list is accompanied by internationally agreed definitions, by model questions, and by proposed disaggregations and response categories. And it is also meant to evolve with the digital economy. Currently, it includes what you see in the slide, 12 indicators on how do businesses use ICT, 2 indicators on the value added and workforce of the ICT producing sector, 2 indicators on trade in ICT goods, 2 on international trade in ICT services, and 2 on trade in ICT-enabled services or digitally deliverable services. So part of it is business statistics and part of it is international trade statistics. The core list has been an important achievement in supporting the increased availability of digital economy statistics from developing countries. Next slide, please. Another important achievement of our work is the increased awareness of the need for digital economy statistics. And in a survey we conducted in 2024 with a partnership on measuring ICT for development, countries indicated a high or very high demand for indicators on the use of ICT by businesses. So the pressing need for statistics to inform policy making and get a grasp of the magnitude and the impact of digitalization on developing countries is evident. But the actual availability remains lower than we would like. Next slide, please. The very basic indicators are available in more than half the developing countries interviewed, but the more granular indicators remain scarce. This is a list of the core list of indicators that I mentioned before. It's both progress from the nothing that we had 20 years ago, but it's also an ongoing challenge to increase the availability of these statistics. European countries and emerging economies that are part of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD, have built up a robust time series of comparable-based indicators, but developing lower-income countries, and in particular SIDS, still have a long way to go. Next slide, please. The most obvious issue for the lack of official digital economy statistics is that many indicators, in particular those of technology used by businesses, have to be collected through business surveys, and surveys are costly. Our 2024 survey showed that the funding of such surveys from a regular budget of the National Statistical System is still low, and the sustainability of regular surveys must look to sources of funding that are not international cooperation, and digital economy statistics should become part of the regular statistical production of a country. We recognize that many SIDS have many other priorities that surpass digital economy statistics, but I cannot emphasize enough how important it is to accommodate at least a regular production of basic indicators to guide digital economy policy and digital trade policies. Otherwise, SIDS are flying blind in how to benefit and better participate in increasingly digitalized international trade. Next slide, please. So in the short to medium term, UNCTAD will continue to support all countries, including SIDS, in their efforts to improve the availability of e-commerce and the digital economy statistics. Since 2023, we were able to provide regional training on producing ICT in business statistics and regional workshops on measuring digital trade to Pacific countries as part of the Pacific Digital Economy Program that my colleague just mentioned, and also to the Caribbean. I have to note that cooperation with other agencies has been instrumental to be able to deliver this capacity building, because countries are not the only ones facing funding constraints on digital economy statistics. As you all know, UNCTAD depends on extra budgetary funding for technical assistance, and the funding from development partners on statistical development is also limited. I do encourage you to support participation of statistical experts again for the December working group and the consultation process on the review of the core list of e-commerce and digital economy indicators that will be launched at that meeting. There is also a set of new statistical guidelines on measuring the value of e-commerce that is set to come out at the beginning of 2026, and that should be accompanied by dissemination activities and capacity building for producers of official statistics. And finally, we will continue to partner with other agencies to deliver capacity building when we can, but also to continue fundraising efforts with our development partners so they can contribute to the statistical work in the e-commerce and digital economy program. And hopefully, the UNCTAD 16 mandate will reinforce the message that we must strengthen and improve the evidence base on digitalization by building the capacity of statistical experts and to guide policymakers. Next slide, please. So, because the work on e-commerce and digital economy measurement is only becoming more urgent and complex, we are also looking at how to tap non-survey-based data sources, such as balance of payments, customs records, and credit card transaction reports. We also need to clarify how platformization, artificial intelligence, and big data are monetized and affect trade flows and value chains. We need to better account for trading services that are delivered digitally. And last but not least, at the same time, we must keep asking the question on whether we should or could measure everything and contribute to the discussions in the international statistical community so that we can decide all together what is feasible and what is useful and relevant. Next slide, please. Finally, I would just like to direct your attention to the latest publications from the e-commerce and digital economy branch, which are available online and make a point of including examples of SIDS in their analysis or are devoted to the Pacific on cyber loss taxation, digital trade measurement, and the Pacific Digital Economy Report of 2024. Also, to let you know that we will have an exhibit at UNCTAD 16 on Tuesday, 21 October, which is the day dedicated to a ministerial roundtable and a forum on digital for development issues. So you are welcome to continue the discussion with us then. And then the last slide. If you wish to approach us after UNCTAD 16, we are here. Thank you.